My topic is money itself. I'd like to harken back to the video that you showed of that wonderful speaker at the COP26 who talked about the $25 trillion worth of allocation and money, and how little of it was getting to the areas of need throughout the world. And that I would point out that the world is awash with money, but the areas where we need it the most, are experiencing significant scarcity. So my research ultimately evolved into actually what is money itself and where does it come from, who controls it, et cetera. Because if we can get to an understanding of that, then we can break through the stranglehold of lack of money that is impeding so many elements of our efforts in sustainability and other issues in the world. So let me first start off by giving you a bit about my background, so it has some context of how did I come to what I explored and the conclusions, etc. I am your classic Silicon Valley entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur. After Vietnam and college and marriage, I started my first business in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1977. And then subsequently, over the next approximate 31 years, I started and ran more than a half a dozen small businesses in diverse industries. And I'm a little sidebar here that at one point I was working with Hewlett-Packard in trying to put together what would have been the first corporate incubator in Silicon Valley. We didn't complete the project, but that gives you a sense of my background and experience. But as a serial entrepreneur, I had a lot of direct experience with the kinds of issues that most small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, struggle with. And SMEs, in my experience, are the economic backbone of local economies everywhere in the world. Yet their most common problem is lack of funding, both in the form of capital and credit. So that contrasts with here in the United States, Wall Street and big businesses, which are owned predominantly by the 1% of the population, they're awash with money, and increasingly so, that big businesses have no difficulty in raising capital or credit, but not so with small businesses. So looking at my experiences in that entrepreneurial space, I decided I wanted to leverage that experience. And in 2008, I launched a small nonprofit think tank focused on local economic development issues, and in particular, the issues related to SMEs and their role in local economies. And I wanted to address their particular needs, and that focused very much on money. Well, in the process, that took me deep into two aspects of money: the capital formation space, if I need to raise money to be able to launch my business or grow my business, etc. What are the issues that are involved there? And my research was actually used by the White House to help craft the Jobs Act back in 2012, which was the key legislation that legalized crowdfunding in the United States. I also spent a great deal of time in the public banking space, was one of the experts in this space and advising various governments and others about setting up banks that would be owned by governments or nonprofits, and therefore their constituencies are the general public rather than shareholders. And globally, something like 25 to 40% of all banking is actually fitting in within this public banking space. But the United States has a paucity of that. So we've been trying to advance that. Ultimately, though, those efforts led me in 2017 to look at money itself rather than the institutions and systems that provide money. And in the process, that's when I discovered the financial underpinnings to our current financial ecosystem, and in particular, where money comes from and who controls it. And if you understand that reality, it then becomes self-evident, for one, why we have scarcity in this sea of abundance, and why the 1% are actually increasing and gaining wealth while the rest of us are losing it. So let's start with the key question: where does money come from? Most people are going to guess that it comes from the government, but in reality, they would be wrong. That, believe it or not, that the vast majority of money that is in circulation worldwide, and I don't care whose economy you're talking about, with few exceptions, about 97% of all money that is in circulation actually originates from banks. And obviously banks are predominantly owned by the 1%. And there is a key clue there about this idea of the wealth spread. So the question is, well, how did that come about? How come banks are actually the source of money in our circulation? Turns out that about 300 years ago, bankers got the King of England to let them privatize money creation. As you can see, that the king wanted to fight France, and so the bankers, said, well, if you let us create the money, we'll provide it for you. Once they set that model, that what you find is the majority of other countries around the globe followed suit and granted or chartered their banks to privatize the creation of the money for that country. So that leads to the question, well, how do banks actually create money? Well, it turns out that most people erroneously assume that banks lend money that's on deposit by depositors. In reality, banks actually create deposits when they issue new money with each loan that they issue. And they do so by basically collateralizing your loan documents as an asset on their balance sheet, and then offset it with a brand new liability over in the deposit side. So they actually are creating deposits using your own creditworthiness as the way of creating money. That little ledger domain, the sleight of hand, was revealed by the Bank of England back in 2014. And prior to that, even the majority of the people in the banking industry didn't understand that they actually create money with each new loan. So the question is, how does that create a wealth concentration for the few and the scarcity for the rest of us? Turns out that when banks create the loan, they only create the principal, but not the interest. Yet the borrowers have to pay back more than they borrow. So the question that leads to is, where's that interest come from? And it turns out that the borrowers essentially have to go pull that money somehow, some way out of general circulation, which got established by other loans. So, and if they fail to pay back that principal and the interest, they wind up forfeiting the collateral that they pledged for that loan. So in either case, whether they're pulling interest out of the economy or they're having to sacrifice the collateral that they put up, that translates to that bit by bit, the more and more of the wealth of the 99% is getting transferred to the 1%. So that's really the underlying driver behind the concept of wealth concentration in around the world. So the key question that leads to then is, well, is there any alternative available to us? Because if we're all currently stuck in this paradigm and that we're kind of like fish in water, that we don't even realize we have that water around us, the economic system, which is essentially owned and controlled by the bankers, establishes the have and have nots conditions that we would obviously like to break out of if we want to try and address sustainability issues and so on. And so the key answer to that is, if the bankers can create money out of thin air, so can we. And that is one of the key fundamentals that I discovered, is the idea that we, the people, are capable of issuing our own money. It's something that is now becoming very self-evident to a lot of people because of the high popularity of cryptocurrencies. which is money, private money, that is issued by non-government or non-bank sources. But the key is that cryptocurrencies are actually, latecomers to the game, as I say here, that the idea of alternative currencies, non-national currencies, have actually been around for a very long time. And we can actually trace their existence working alongside national economies as a practice that literally can be traced all the way back to ancient Egypt. And here in the United States, even our Federal Reserve has published several articles affirming that not only can we legally issue our own money, but that concept has frequently been done in the past. And in fact, more often is done during times of economic crisis rather than when there are good times. So if you look then at all these different examples of the use of private money throughout history, what you're going to find is that it's been done thousands of times, typically on a localized basis. What you'll find is lots of times a community will issue its own currency in order to encourage the local citizens to buy from their local businesses in programs called buy local campaigns. The issue there, though, is the vast majority of them produced very limited benefits, for the regions. It's a measurable benefit, but it's not really significant. However, through my research, I discovered that there were various times throughout history where private money actually created widespread prosperity for the general public. I'll give one example in addition to the one I'll give in my next screen, that during the middle of the Great Depression, a small town in Austria, the mayor there decided to hire contractors directly to do work for the city and just simply printed up his own money and paid them. They went from 30+% unemployment to near zero in a matter of weeks, and hundreds of communities across Europe wanted to replicate it till the central bankers came in and outlawed those kinds of currencies. There's an even more dramatic period, which I point out here in this example, that most people are unaware of, that there was about a 250-year period during the Central Middle Ages where there actually was greater prosperity for the general public than even for the most part throughout the world today. And that was very specific dates between 1040 and 1290. And that's when there was over 1,000 cathedrals and 350,000 churches built throughout Western Europe using money, such as Notre Dame was issued or built by the Parisians issuing their own money. Of course, these large infrastructure projects were often 50 to 100 years long, so they kept issuing money, during that time frame that kept pumping more money into the local economy. And those infrastructure projects were not paid for by government money or church money. So as a result of that, massive infrastructure project, that Western Europe experienced really significant prosperity. And those investments, as it's kind of self-evident, that those cathedrals serve as attractants to tourists, even to this day, 800 years later. So the key question there was, what did these folks do differently than the vast majority of folks that issue their own local currency? And what I determined was that in most cases that the average program issues a currency, a non or private currency, in exchange for the national currency. So they're really just swapping one currency for another. In contrast, like the mayor that was in Austria, or all these communities throughout Europe during that Central Middle Ages, they essentially do what I call spent money into existence. They essentially issued the money directly in exchange for labor, not money, and thereby they continuously injected new money into the local economy. Once we understood that concept, that we were able to take those various elements and build them into an entire economic development system that we call the Sustainable Communities Framework. And you can get the details of that from my white paper that drills into what is money, where's it come from, and then the history of the successful paradigms, and then what we can do about it now. The key here message that I would like to leave with everybody is we are not locked into this assumption that we don't have enough money to solve our problems. Thank you.